Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast, where we talk with the people behind the current events and breakthroughs in brain implants in an understandable way, helping bring together various fields involved in neuroprosthetics. Here is your host, Laden Yurachek.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Neural Implant Podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Kevin Tracey, and he's the president and CEO of Feinstein Institute for Medical Research. And he's actually a neuromodulation mogul, I guess, because he found out that neuromodulation can affect immune response. This is actually the second time he's on the show, so he's going to be giving a little bit of an update. But just real fast, let's get everybody on the same page. Do you want to introduce yourself and talk about some of your work, especially as neuromodulation pertains to immune response?
Thank you. Yes, I am a neurosurgeon who's been studying inflammation for the past 35 years or so. And during the course of those studies, we became very interested in the idea that you can treat inflammation by blocking molecules like TNF. And that really led to the next question of if we can block TNF with drugs, is it also possible to block TNF and other inflammatory using neurostimulating devices? And that really was the beginning of the last 20 years of work in understanding how to hack into the vagus nerve in order to treat inflammation.
Okay. And then from that, you guys spun off SetPoint Medical and other tech, and then Feinstein Institute is a big part of this, basically building off of this work.
So the Feinstein Institute is an independent research institute, which is the home for research at Northwell Health in New York. The Feinstein is really 5 institutes now. One of the 5 institutes is the Institute of Bioelectronic Medicine, led by Yusuf Alabed and Lopa Mishra. There's about 75 NIH investigators running laboratories in these 5 institutes across several campuses. So it's a very exciting, dynamic place. In addition to bioelectronic medicine, we have research institutes focused on cancer, behavioral health outcomes or health system sciences, and molecular medicine. So it's a very vibrant, exciting place. And as I said, one of the major interests of the Feinstein Institutes is bioelectronic medicine, something that we have been interested in, as I said before, for about 20 years now.
Wow, that's incredible. And so last time when we talked, May 2020, I think we might have recorded it earlier. Obviously, it was 2020, so pandemic, everything was upside down. But then you were telling me before we started recording that it was also especially busy for you at that time. So what were you up to around then?
So in May of 2020, we were still deep in the throes of clinical trials for experimental therapies to treat COVID-19. We had just gone through a wave of COVID in New York City that took thousands of lives and closed down, as everyone knows, closed down the city and put many of the hospitals on the brink. So our hospital system handled the majority of the COVID cases in New York City. And Northwell Health had a real leadership role through the research that we published in defining the clinical course of COVID-19 and in perfecting best treatment protocols. And when we saw the mortality rates from the early days of COVID driven way down by how much we and others learned about the optimal ways to treat the disease. We also did some interesting clinical trials based on the idea that the vagus nerve can suppress inflammation. And as we were able to learn from May of 2020, over the 2 years, we discovered that a drug called Famotidine, which is sold as a generic drug, Pepcid, and other brand names as well, that Famotidine is actually a pharmacological or a drug-based vagus nerve stimulator. And we proved first in mice that Famotidine placed directly in very small amounts, placed directly in the brains of mice, activates the vagus nerve. And in these same mice, taking Famotidine or having Famotidine put in their brain, that the Famotidine turned on the vagus nerve, and this turned off cytokine storm, which of course is a big problem in COVID-19. And we published those results and then did a clinical trial of Famotidine in patients with COVID-19. And we published that as well and showed that taking famotidine in the early days, in the early stages of COVID, decreased the cytokine production in these patients and also accelerated their recovery. It shortened the duration of the illness and was associated with a clinically better outcome. So it was interesting to see that a generic drug, cheap, safe, decades-old generic drug could have this effect through the vagus nerve.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. And it makes sense because a big part of COVID too was not only the respiratory issues, but yeah, like the immune response. And that was the confounding factors for a lot of doctors in the beginning is just, okay, we can treat the respiratory side, but we can't, what do we do about the immune side? Yeah, that's pretty incredible. So I don't know could you share some numbers or is there some kind of, I don't know, general takeaways, quantitative takeaways? Is it 20% better or is it the intensity is better or the survival rate was better or how did it look?
So the patients were outpatients. They were studied in their homes. And so thankfully, there were no deaths in the patients that we studied. But the severity of the disease was attenuated by some 20 or 30% in many of the patients. And the duration of the disease severity was shortened by 2 or 3 days. So yeah, it was statistically significant, and it was the kind of result that if you have COVID, you might want to read that paper or ask your doctor about taking famotidine. The data are pretty clear, and much of these studies have been replicated by other groups looking at the mortality rate of patients admitted to the hospital who were already taking famotidine for other gastrointestinal illnesses. And once again, what the data show from looking at tens of thousands of patients is that the patients taking famotidine tended to have better outcomes. So it's interesting that in the early days of this famotidine question, the question was, how could it possibly be working? And once we discovered that the famotidine can actually activate the vagus nerve to turn off cytokine storm, it raises a whole series of other interesting questions, which are still, frankly, the answer is not known. One question is, can you use famotidine to treat inflammation in other situations like autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, or other conditions? And another question is, what is it about famotidine in the brain? What is the mechanism of famotidine in the brain that leads to increasing signaling in the vagus nerve? And those are things that can be addressed in additional research going forward for a drug that I said before is generic, over-the-counter, very cheap, and very safe. So it's interesting to think about how much we can still learn about things that have been around for decades, like aspirin and famotidine.
That's a really crazy thing to think about. This brings up a few questions. If this treatment was very successful, obviously doctors are looking for the best way to treat COVID. Why didn't it become standard practice? I hadn't heard about this before now.
So what happened during COVID was the politicization, the interjection of politics into rational discourse. And that complicated absolutely everything. It complicated the adoption and use of vaccines, which are life-saving and, if not history-changing and historic. It adopted the discussion about trials and clinical protocols, and it influenced the discussion about the results of scientific studies published in peer-reviewed journals for drugs that were not being promoted by for-profit entities. For instance, famotidine, as I said before, is generic, over-the-counter, safe, off-patent, for which there's no big corporate sponsor that stood up to take the studies we and other people did involving dozens or several hundred patients and replicating them on large studies involving thousands of patients. The reality at the end of the day, to get these answers to these questions involving thousands of patients costs millions and millions, if not tens of millions of dollars just to do the clinical studies. At which point, to define the utility or the use of the drug at the cost of tens of millions of dollars, somebody has to figure out how to then sell it afterwards and recoup that tens of millions of dollars. And there's not an obvious path for that to happen. I saw recently in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, I believe, a discussion by a not-for-profit group that was developing naltrexone, which is also generic. And the idea was that the not-for-profit group would get the FDA approvals for the distribution of naltrexone as a treatment for opioid overdose. And they would do this by essentially giving it away at cost. So when you take the profit question out of this, it raises really interesting possibilities for other generic drugs that might be effective in other clinical conditions. But somebody has to start the ball rolling down the hill with the upfront costs of the big, expensive clinical trials. That's probably why you never heard of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That is a weakness in this market-based healthcare system that we have. But yeah, I'm looking at famotidine, and I hadn't heard about it before, but actually it is very common. It's used to decrease stomach acid production and is basically Pepcid AC. So it's amazing that such a simple thing that, over the counter or quite general drug could have this effect. But that's very interesting. Okay, you're saying the famotidine has this effect on the vagus nerve. Does this mean we no longer need vagus nerve stimulators? Can we just take Pepcid AC and then have a lot of autoimmune or other, vagus nerve things reduced?
No, it doesn't mean that. First of all, the clinical trials for famotidine have been done in, as I said before, several dozen or a couple of hundred patients. So there's not enough clinical trial experience to say anything about autoimmune disease or autoinflammation or using famotidine as an anti-inflammatory. I think that those things should be studied, but we can't say anything about that today. What we know in mice is that there's evidence that famotidine can activate the vagus nerve, but we don't know whether the effectiveness of the vagus nerve activation would be any way comparable to using a vagus nerve stimulator. What we know about using a vagus nerve stimulator is that can be done safely and effectively in a very reliable way. And we know this because vagus nerve stimulators have already been being used to treat epilepsy for 30 plus years. And we know that probably upwards of 200,000 or 250,000 patients have had vagus nerve stimulators implanted. And we know that it's safe. And we know that it's effective for stimulating the nerve. As we continue to look at results coming out of clinical trials using vagus nerve stimulators to treat rheumatoid arthritis and inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's disease, what we're seeing is that many of the patients have significant clinical responses. Not all, but many of the patients have very significant clinical responses. We know that we've seen now long-term results from patients who were implanted years ago who seem to have disease remission, meaning they're not taking other medications and they have no signs and symptoms of their illness. We know from the FDA governed experience with vagus nerve stimulation for epilepsy that it's safe, that the side effect profile is extremely limited, minimal side effects. And we know that when you compare those results of clinical response from many of the patients to a safe intervention using a vagus nerve implant, that when you compare that to the current therapy for autoimmune disease, which involves injections, very expensive biologic agents, sometimes $100,000 per year that can bankrupt patients. And worse yet, perhaps, these same drugs are at best minimally effective in 40% of the patients, maybe 50% in some cases, but they have black box warnings. That means that the side effects of these treatments includes the possibility of death, cancer, immunosuppression, and sepsis. It's too early to say for sure what's going to happen, but the data from the clinic so far for vagus nerve stimulation to treat autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and Crohn's disease is extremely promising. A company that I've co-founded, SetPoint Medical, is currently deep into clinical trials in the United States called RESET-RA, which is on clinicaltrials.gov or on the SetPoint website for rheumatoid arthritis patients. And that trial is enrolled many patients, up to, I think, 250 patients will be studied according to the websites. And we're hoping that goes very well. And I'm hoping that leads to FDA approval for vagus nerve stimulation in the US in the coming days or in the coming months or year.
Wow. Yeah, that's exciting. That's a very big trial. And hopefully at that point, it'll be confirmed or very assured. So another thing I wanted to talk about, you guys had a very successful Bioelectronic Medicine Summit. I wasn't able to attend. I had a lot of friends that were able to attend, and it sounded like a really good time. Do you want to talk a little bit about this as well?
Sure. We have been, the Feinstein Institute, and my colleagues and I here have been hosting a Bioelectronic Medicine Summit for many years. Usually we do it every other year, sometimes every year. And the first one was in New York. We had another one in Stockholm. And most recently, the summit was again here in New York. And it was a 2.5-day summit, and it was extremely well attended. And what's so exciting about the field and the summit is that you see the best of the best in bioelectronic medicine because people come together from different fields. So bioelectronic medicine, just to define it a little bit, it's not just neuromodulation, it's not just molecular medicine, and it's not just neuroscience. It's all of the above. And so I think my favorite definition of bioelectronic medicine is targeting specific molecular mechanisms through neural circuits that can be modulated with bioengineered devices. And when you think of that as a field, it brings together biomedical engineering, expertise, with, of course, expertise in neuromodulation and machine learning and AI. It brings in the best in molecular medicine and molecular biology, studying drug target interactions and disease mechanisms. And it brings in the best in neuroscience, looking at expertise in neural network signaling and neural network analysis and neuroscientific mechanisms of neural function. So all of that was represented at this meeting. There were some absolutely tremendous talks.
Wow. Yeah. No, I think that's really cool. And I definitely want to attend next time. I learned about it too late. Yeah. What were some of your favorite ones, or did you guys present as well? What did that look like?
Yes, so we had several presenters from the Feinstein Institute. I opened the meeting with a discussion of the rapid growth of this field over 20 years, from a sort of a niche field of a few of us looking at vagus nerve signaling to the immune system, to now hundreds of laboratories around the world working in the space of neuroimmunology, looking at mechanisms by which neural circuits can impact all different aspects of immunity, innate and adaptive immunity, and how steady progress in understanding these neuroimmune mechanisms has spawned dozens and dozens of clinical trials. I also spoke a little bit about how in my own lab, my colleagues and I have shifted our interests from focusing primarily on how is it that the outgoing signals traveling down the vagus nerve are able to control inflammation and what those mechanisms are. And we've shifted our work from that, which is quite developed now and all published. We've shifted much of our interest to two other areas. One is, how does the vagus nerve respond to inflammation? Because the first step in a reflex is always the sensory input. And so the question is, how does the vagus nerve sense or respond to inflammation and infection and injury as it's occurring? And we've got some very exciting new results in that space. And the second area that we're focused on is, once the brain receives the information up the sensory vagus nerve, how does it process that information? So what happens inside the brain when signals come up the vagus nerve that there's large amounts of IL-1 or large amounts of TNF or large amounts of inflammation? What are the neural networks and neural circuits in the brain that are activated? And how do those culminate on activating signals to go back down the vagus nerve to control the inflammation? So that's what we're spending a lot of time on.
Okay. Yeah, it's very exciting. You mentioned some interesting results. Is that something you can share now, or is that something that we should be on the lookout for?
Sure. So we have a paper that'll be coming out very soon in molecular medicine. And the project was led by my colleague, Sangeeta Shivan, and I, and the first author who did most of the work as a postdoc, Harold Silverman. And this project is fascinating because It looks at a subset of sensory neurons in the vagus nerve, which are defined because they express a channel called TRPA1, which is an ion channel that has been studied for many years as a cold receptor or a cold sensor that could also be activated by noxious chemicals. And we wondered whether, since noxious chemicals are produced during inflammation, whether this same neurons expressing TRPA1 might also be involved in sensing the response to a cytokine called IL-1. And in fact, what we show in this paper is that the TRPA1 neurons, called nociceptors, are necessary and sufficient to activate the inflammatory reflex. And we proved this using genetic manipulation of mice to selectively knock out the vagus neurons that express TRPA1. And when you administer IL-1 to those animals, they don't respond. So although the IL-1 is floating around in the animal's bloodstream because we've injected it, the animals behave as if they never received any IL-1 because the vagus nerve is necessary and sufficient to transmit the signals about the presence of IL-1 up to the brain, and the brain is then responsible for producing the sickness behavior that IL-1 normally causes. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, you were also featured last year in 2022 in Wall Street Journal and New York Times, which I guess is just down the street from you guys, right? What was that like, and what were, I guess, the articles about?
The articles came on the heels of a tremendous interest in whether vagus nerve stimulation can be used effectively to treat patients with rheumatoid arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, but also other indications. And this includes depression, anxiety syndromes, and other behavioral illnesses. And what's being talked about a lot is whether it works, whether it requires surgically implanted devices only, or whether it can also be done using non-invasive devices. And there's a lot of unknowns in all those topics, but there's also a lot of, I think, misinformation and disinformation being promulgated in social media and elsewhere. And I was really pleased with the coverage in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal, because both of those articles gave very objective, factual-based assessments of the current state of vagus nerve stimulation, for what we know about the mechanisms and where the clinical trials are headed and are heading. Yeah, those were very good articles, very responsible reporting.
It's nice when the writers actually get things right, because I've seen it not been the case sometimes, and yeah, they get basic facts wrong too. But yeah, that's really interesting stuff. So congratulations on that. Hopefully that brought more eyeballs and attention to this and maybe get more talent into the field. So we were originally going to do this at the end of 2022 as an outlook for 2023 and beyond. So what's exciting you now for 2023, and what's on the horizon for you for the next few years?
I think for 2023 and perhaps early into 2024, I hope and pray that the current clinical trials that are occurring in the U.S. for vagus nerve stimulation to treat rheumatoid arthritis and other conditions, that they produce successful results that lead ultimately to the widespread approvals by the FDA and the adoption and the use of these therapies. I think that once that happens, I think we're going to see an explosion of clinical use of bioelectronic devices for a range of diseases. There is tremendous interest in the basic neuroimmune mechanisms by which the brain and the immune system are interconnected and affect each other. And there are tremendous opportunities through neuroengineering and neuromodulation to hack the nervous system, the brain directly, or the vagus nerve or other nerves, to modulate specific mechanisms of immunity. The key is we need more people working in this space, as you hinted at. And I'm hoping 2023 and 2024, through this explosion of interest that's occurring in science and medicine around the idea of bioelectronic medicine, that this attracts a lot more young people and old people and middle-aged people to come into the field and work on some fascinating and important and impactful questions. And the more people that are working on this and the more interest that we can raise and create on this, I'm convinced that this will accelerate the adoption of these ideas into clinical usefulness, which is ultimately why I've been working on for the last 20 plus years. What I care about is obviously doing good science, but not just science for the sake of science, but science for the sake of producing things that can help patients. And I think we're very close now for vagus nerve stimulation becoming a reality for millions of patients. And I hope and I see a time when patients have the option of choosing vagus nerve stimulation as a simple, safe therapy instead of dangerous, expensive drugs with black box warnings that are minimally effective. So that's what I think is going to happen in the coming year or two, and I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that is really exciting. And I'm somebody who doesn't like pharmaceutical solutions usually. And if, for example, if I had this issue, then that would be something I would probably try earlier rather than later. And yeah, that really is exciting. I think it'll open the floodgates to bioelectronic medicine. And like you said, we need more people in the field, but at the same time, those people need to be paid, and you need to have viable companies and treatments and products that you're offering, and they need to work in order for people to pay for them. And so it's this, self-feeding cycle, and one thing leads to another. Hopefully this FDA approval, and knock on wood, when it happens, then it'll kick off this, exponential growth in the field.
You said in the beginning you would try it. If you had a condition, you would try it before some of these other drugs, but the reality is patients can't try it. There's until we finish this process of testing, which is going beautifully well, but until it's finished, we can't even offer this to patients. And this is what I hope, is that, like you said, I hope that people like you may have the choice someday, but we have to get through this last phase of clinical testing to an FDA approval before that will become a reality.
Yeah, definitely. Well, Dr. Tracey, this has been really interesting. Hopefully we'll keep an eye out. Maybe we'll have you on again to talk about this, and we can pop open a bottle of champagne together. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to mention?
No, I think we covered it all. Thank you for a great conversation, and wish you a great day as well.
Hope you enjoyed the show and were able to learn something new, bringing together different fields in novel ways. Until next time on the Neural Implant Podcast.